Hello everyone. Tyrants do not create tyranny, your compliance and obedience does. Believe nothing and question everything. Is our society rapidly nearing the critical threshold of widespread psychosis? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section, please. I found this rather interesting and educational at the same time. I thought it best to share with you all. Have you ever wondered why societies sometimes seem to lose their collective? Have you wondered why rational people can suddenly embrace irrational beliefs in masses? Have you ever wondered how politicians manage to mess up brains? They tell us lies and we simply run with it at times. Have we stopped questioning and finding the truth? Remember during COVID how anxiety drove some people to a state of panic? This was spreading through the population worse than a contagious disease. It was harder to find the escape route. How you noticed how some people can be so obedient and submissive to the mercy of the other person. You find the person practically handing total control of their lives to a boyfriend or girlfriend, and the politicians too are doing it to the population every day. Only the people with knowledge and wisdom will quickly realize that their minds are being messed about, and quickly put a stop to it or simply stop following or believing. It is absolutely scary when you hear people from the past or you read something from the past. Do you notice that they spoke more intelligently than people do now? In the USA and England, ignorance is promoted by some politicians and the pulpit conmen. Freedom of speech is being annihilated by politicians and conmen. Just before we proceed, please kindly subscribe to the channel. Once again, I thank all the subscribers who have supported me over the months. Much appreciation to you. Please take a listen. I hope you will find it interesting and educational. Here we go.
Mirlu explains in his book, The Rape of the Mind, it is simply a question of reorganizing. Have you ever wondered why societies sometimes seem to lose their collective minds? Why seemingly rational people can suddenly embrace irrational beliefs in masses? These phenomena have puzzled thinkers and historians for centuries. This dangerous social phenomenon is called mass psychosis. But before we discuss this, consider this quote from the renowned psychologist Gustave Le Bon. The masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error, if error seduce them. Whoever can supply them with illusions is easily their master. Whoever attempts to destroy their illusions is always their victim. This sobering observation sets the stage for our exploration of how entire societies can descend into madness. You probably think that, surely, the greatest threats to civilization are natural disasters, diseases, or external conflicts. But what if I told you that according to the famous psychologist Carl Jung, the greatest danger lies within our own minds? Jung argued that our inability to deal with the forces of our own psyche poses the most significant threat to our civilization. It's as if we're our own worst enemies, or as the Latin proverb puts it, man is wolf to man. Jung considered this a sad, yet eternal truism. But when does this wolf-like nature come to the forefront? Jung observed that it's most prominent during those dark periods of history, when mental illness becomes the norm rather than the exception in a society. He termed this disturbing phenomenon a psychic epidemic. In his work, The Symbolic Life, Jung writes, "Indeed, it is becoming ever more obvious that it is not famine, not earthquakes, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself who is man's greatest danger to man, for the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes." It's a chilling thought, isn't it? So, what exactly is a mass psychosis? Simply put, it's an epidemic of madness. It occurs when a large portion of society loses touch with reality and descends into delusions. Now, you might be tempted to dismiss this as mere fiction, but history provides us with all too real examples. Consider the witch hunts that swept through America and Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. During this period, thousands of individuals, mostly women, were killed, not for any crimes they actually committed, but because they became scapegoats in societies gripped by collective madness. Frances Hill, in her book, A Delusion of Satan, writes that in some Swiss villages, there were scarcely any women left alive after the frenzy had finally burned itself out. Or think about the rise of totalitarianism in the 20th century. Millions of people embraced ideologies that, in hindsight, seem obviously destructive and delusional. Yet, at the time, entire nations fell under their spell. The results of a mass psychosis are nothing short of devastating. Jung studied this phenomenon extensively and observed that when a society succumbs to madness, its members become morally and spiritually inferior. They sink unconsciously to an inferior intellectual level, becoming more unreasonable, irresponsible, emotional, erratic, and unreliable. But perhaps most terrifying of all, Jung noted that crimes the individual alone could never stand are freely committed by the group. This explains how ordinarily moral people can participate in atrocities during times of mass psychosis. What makes this phenomenon even more insidious is that those caught in its grip are often unaware of what's happening. Just as an individual experiencing psychosis can't step outside their own mind to recognize their delusions, there's no Archimedean point from which those living through a mass psychosis can observe their collective madness. So, what causes a mass psychosis? To answer this, we need to first understand what drives an individual to madness. While there are many potential triggers, such as drug abuse, brain injuries, or other physical ailments, we are particularly interested in psychological or psychogenic causes. These are the most common culprits behind mass psychosis. The most prevalent psychogenic cause of psychosis is a flood of negative emotions, particularly fear or anxiety, that drives an individual into a state of panic. Now, imagine this panic spreading through a population like a contagious disease. That's the starting point of a mass psychosis. When in a state of panic, it's natural to seek relief. It's mentally and physically exhausting to remain in such a hyper-emotional state. While there are healthy ways to cope with panic, such as facing and overcoming the fear-inducing threat, another escape route is a psychotic break. Now, contrary to popular belief, a psychotic break isn't a descent into greater disorder. Instead, it's a reordering of one's experiential world. It blends fact and fiction, reality and delusions in a way that helps alleviate the feelings of panic. It's a coping mechanism, albeit a maladaptive one. Silvano Arrietty, one of the 20th century's foremost authorities on schizophrenia, outlined the psychogenic steps that lead to madness. First, there's the phase of panic, where the individual starts perceiving things differently, becomes frightened, appears confused, and can't explain the strange occurrences they're experiencing. This is followed by what Arrietty calls the phase of psychotic insight. During this phase, the individual succeeds in putting things together by creating a pathological way of seeing reality. This allows them to explain their abnormal experiences. Arrietty calls it insight because the patient finally sees meaning in their experiences, but it's psychotic because it's based on delusions rather than a realistic understanding of the situation. In essence, the delusions allow the panic-stricken individual to escape from the flood of negative emotions, but at the cost of losing touch with reality. As Arrietty puts it, a psychotic break can be viewed as an abnormal way of dealing with an extreme state of anxiety. Now, let's scale this up to a societal level. If a flood of negative emotions can trigger a psychotic break in a vulnerable individual, then a mass psychosis can result when a population of vulnerable individuals is driven into a state of panic by threats, real, imagined, or fabricated. But here's where it gets interesting, because delusions can take many forms, and madness can manifest in countless ways. The specific manner in which a mass psychosis unfolds will differ, based on the historical and cultural context of the affected society. In our modern era, one form of mass psychosis stands out as particularly threatening: the psychosis of totalitarianism. Arthur Versluis defines totalitarianism as the modern phenomenon of total centralized state power, coupled with the obliteration of individual human rights. In the totalized state, there are those in power, and they're the objectified masses, the victims. In a totalitarian society, a disturbing transformation occurs. The population is divided into two groups: the rulers and the ruled. Both groups undergo a pathological change. The rulers are elevated to an almost godlike status, which stands in stark contrast to our nature as imperfect beings who are easily corrupted by power. The masses, on the other hand, are reduced to dependent subjects of these pathological rulers, taking on a psychologically regressed childlike status. Hannah Arendt, one of the 20th century's preeminent scholars of totalitarianism, described it as an attempted transformation of human nature itself. But this transformation doesn't create a utopia. It turns sound minds into sick ones. As a Dutch medical doctor who studied the mental effects of totalitarianism observed, there is in fact much that is comparable between the strange reactions of the citizens of totalitarianism and their culture as a whole on the one hand, and the reactions of the sick schizophrenic on the other. The social transformation that unfolds under totalitarianism is built upon and sustained by delusions. Think about it. Only deluded individuals would regress to the childlike status of obedient and submissive subjects, handing over complete control of their lives to politicians and bureaucrats. Only a deluded ruling class would believe they possess the knowledge, wisdom, and acumen to completely control society in a top-down manner. And only under the spell of delusions would anyone believe that a society composed of power-hungry rulers and a psychologically regressed population could lead to anything other than mass suffering and social ruin. The mass psychosis of totalitarianism has been induced many times throughout history. As Just Mirlu explains in his book, The Rape of the Mind, it is simply a question of reorganizing and manipulating collective feelings in the proper way. The method by which the ruling elite accomplishes this is called menticide, which literally means killing of the mind. Mirlu describes it as an organized system of psychological intervention and judicial perversion through which a ruling class can imprint their own opportunistic thoughts upon the minds of those they plan to use and destroy. So, how does this process of menticide unfold? It begins with the sowing of fear, placing the population in a state of panic that primes them for a descent into delusionary beliefs. One particularly effective technique is the use of waves of terror. Under this method, periods of intense fear-mongering are interspersed with periods of calm, but each period of calm is followed by an even more intense spell of fear, and on the process goes. Mirlu explains the psychological impact. Each wave of terrorizing creates its effects more easily, after a breathing spell, than the one that preceded it, because people are still disturbed by their previous experience. Morality becomes lower and lower, and the psychological effects of each new propaganda campaign become stronger. It reaches a public already softened up. While fear primes a population for menticide, the use of propaganda to spread misinformation and promote confusion regarding the source of threats and the nature of the crisis helps break down the minds of the masses. Government officials and their lackeys in the media can use contradictory reports, nonsensical information, and even blatant lies. The more they confuse, the less capable a population becomes of coping with the crisis and diminishing their fear in a rational and adaptive manner. Confusion, in other words, heightens the susceptibility to descend into the delusions of totalitarianism. As Mirlu puts it, logic can be met with logic, while illogic cannot. It confuses those who think straight. The big lie and monotonously repeated nonsense have more emotional appeal than logic and reason. While the people are still searching for a reasonable counter-argument to the first lie, the totalitarians can assault them with another. In our modern world, the means to manipulate society into the psychosis of totalitarianism have never been more effective. Smartphones and social media, television, and the internet, all in conjunction with bots that spread propaganda and algorithms that quickly censor unwanted information, allow those in power to easily assault the minds of the masses. What's more, the addictive nature of these technologies means that many people voluntarily subject themselves to the ruling elite's propaganda with alarming frequency. Mirlu observed this trend even in the early days of modern technology. Modern technology teaches man to take for granted the world he is looking at. He takes no time to retreat and reflect. Technology lures him on, dropping him into its wheels and movements. No rest, no meditation, no reflection, no conversation. The senses are continually overloaded with stimuli. Man doesn't learn to question his world anymore. The screen offers him answers, ready-made. But there's a further step that would-be totalitarian rulers can take to increase the chance of a totalitarian psychosis, isolating the victims and disrupting normal social interactions. When alone and lacking normal interactions with friends, family, and co-workers, an individual becomes far more susceptible to delusions for several reasons. Firstly, they lose contact with the corrective force of positive examples. Not everyone is tricked by the machinations of the ruling elite, and individuals who see through the propaganda can help free others from the menticidal assault. If, however, isolation is enforced, the power of these positive examples greatly diminishes. Another reason isolation increases the efficacy of menticide is that human beings, like many other species, are more easily conditioned into new patterns of thought and behavior when isolated. Mirlu explains this in relation to the work of physiologist Ivan Pavlov on behavioral conditioning. Pavlov made another significant discovery. The conditioned reflex could be developed most easily in a quiet laboratory with a minimum of disturbing stimuli. Every trainer of animals knows this from his own experience. Isolation and the patient repetition of stimuli are required to tame wild animals. The totalitarians have followed this rule. They know that they can condition their political victims most quickly if they are kept in isolation, alone, confused, and battered by waves of terror. A population under an attack of menticide descends into a hopeless and vulnerable state. The never-ending stream of propaganda turns minds once capable of rational thought into playhouses of irrational forces. With chaos swirling around them and within them, the masses crave a return to a more ordered world. This is when the would-be totalitarians can take the decisive step. They can offer a way out, a return to order in a world that seems to be moving rapidly in the opposite direction. But all this comes at a price. The masses must give up their freedom and cede control of all aspects of life to the ruling elite. They must relinquish their capacity to be self-reliant individuals responsible for their own lives and become submissive and obedient subjects. In other words, the masses must descend into the delusions of the totalitarian psychosis. Mirlu describes this descent vividly. The totalitarian systems of the 20th century represent a kind of collective psychosis. Whether gradually or suddenly, reason and common human decency are no longer possible in such a system. There is only a pervasive atmosphere of terror and a projection of the enemy, imagined to be in our midst. Thus, society turns on itself, urged on by the ruling authorities. But the order promised by a totalitarian world is a pathological order. By enforcing strict conformity and requiring blind obedience from the citizenry, totalitarianism rides the world of the spontaneity that produces many of life's joys and the creativity that drives society forward. The total control of this form of rule, no matter under what name it is branded, be it rule by scientists and doctors, politicians and bureaucrats, or a dictator, breeds stagnation, destruction, and death on a mass scale. So perhaps the most important question facing our world is, how can totalitarianism be prevented? And if a society has been induced into the early stages of this mass psychosis, can the effects be reversed? While one can never be sure of the prognosis of collective madness, there are steps that can be taken to help effect a cure. This task, however, necessitates many different approaches from many different people. Just as the menticidal attack is multi-pronged, so must be the counterattack. According to Carl Jung, for those of us who wish to help return sanity to an insane world, the first step is to bring order to our own minds and to live in a way that provides inspiration for others to follow. It is not for nothing that our age cries out for the Redeemer personality, for the one who can emancipate himself from the grip of the collective psychosis and save at least his own soul, who lights a beacon of hope for others, proclaiming that here is at least one man who has succeeded in extricating himself from the fatal identity with the group psyche. But assuming one is living in a manner free of the grip of the psychosis, there are further steps that can be taken. Firstly, information that counters the propaganda should be spread as far and as wide as possible. The truth is more powerful than the fiction and falsities peddled by would-be totalitarian rulers. So, their success is in part contingent on their ability to censor the free flow of information. Another tactic is to use humor and ridicule to delegitimize the ruling elite. As Mirlu explains, we must learn to treat the demagogue and aspirant dictators in our midst with the weapon of ridicule. The demagogue himself is almost incapable of humor of any sort, and if we treat him with humor, he will begin to collapse. A tactic recommended by Václav Havel, a political dissident under Soviet communist rule who later became president of Czechoslovakia, is the construction of what are called parallel structures. A parallel structure is any form of organization, business, institution, technology, or creative pursuit that exists physically within a totalitarian society, yet morally outside of it. In communist Czechoslovakia, Havel noted that these parallel structures were more effective at combating totalitarianism than political action. Furthermore, when enough parallel structures are created, a second culture or parallel society spontaneously forms and functions as an enclave of freedom and sanity within a totalitarian world. Havel explains in his book, The Power of the Powerless, what else are parallel structures than an area where a different life can be lived? A life that is in harmony with its own aims, and which in turn structures itself in harmony with those aims. What else are those initial attempts at social self-organization than the efforts of a certain part of society to rid itself of the self-sustaining aspects of totalitarianism, and thus to extricate itself radically from its involvement in the totalitarian system? But above all else, what is required to prevent a full descent into the madness of totalitarianism is action by as many people as possible. Just as the ruling elite do not sit around passively but instead take deliberate steps to increase their power, so too must an active and concerted effort be made to move the world back in the direction of freedom. This can be an immense challenge in a world falling prey to the delusions of totalitarianism. But as Thomas Paine noted during another dark period of history, tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. It's important to remember that the battle against totalitarianism is not just a physical or political one, but a psychological one. The ruling elite understand this, which is why they focus so heavily on controlling the narrative and manipulating emotions. To combat this, we must become aware of our own psychological vulnerabilities and work to strengthen our minds against manipulation. One way to do this is through education, not just formal education, but self-education. We must cultivate critical thinking skills, learn to question authority, and develop the ability to recognize propaganda and manipulation when we see it. This includes understanding logical fallacies, being able to fact-check information, and maintaining a healthy skepticism without falling into paranoia. Another crucial aspect is maintaining our humanity and connections with others. Totalitarian systems thrive on dehumanization and isolation. By fostering genuine human connections, practicing empathy, and refusing to see others as mere abstractions or enemies, we resist the totalitarian mindset. We must also be vigilant about protecting our privacy and personal autonomy. As technology advances, it becomes easier for those in power to monitor and control the population. By being conscious of our digital footprint, supporting privacy-protecting technologies, and resisting the urge to trade privacy for convenience, we can make it harder for would-be totalitarians to exert control. It's also crucial to support and protect free speech and freedom of the press. These are often the first casualties in a totalitarian takeover. Even if we disagree with what's being said, defending the right to say it is crucial for maintaining a free society. This includes supporting independent journalism and alternative media outlets that challenge the official narrative. Furthermore, we must be wary of the creep of authoritarianism. Totalitarianism rarely appears overnight. It often creeps in gradually, each small step making the next seem less outrageous. We must be willing to draw lines in the sand and say, no further, to encroachments on our freedoms, even when they're presented as being for our own good. It's worth noting that art and culture play a significant role in this struggle. Totalitarian regimes often seek to control art and suppress creativity because they recognize its power to inspire and unite people. By creating and supporting art that celebrates freedom, individuality, and human dignity, we can help keep the flame of liberty alive, even in dark times. In conclusion, the struggle against the mass psychosis of totalitarianism is one of the most crucial battles of our time. It's a battle fought not just in the halls of power or on the streets, but in the minds and hearts of every individual. The path is not easy, and the outcome is never guaranteed. But as long as there are those who value freedom, who think critically, who maintain their humanity in the face of dehumanizing forces, there is hope. In the words of the philosopher Albert Camus, the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. Let us then commit ourselves to this rebellion of freedom. Let us be the beacon of sanity in an increasingly insane world. The choice, as always, lies with each of us. Will we succumb to the comfortable delusions offered by would-be totalitarians? Or will we embrace the sometimes difficult but ultimately liberating path of freedom and individual responsibility? The future of our societies, and indeed of human civilization itself, may well depend on how we answer this question.